Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that will touch the deepest fibers of your hearts. Today I will take you through the winds of time, toward an era where honor and love intertwine like silk threads on destiny's loom. This is the story of a king who lost his soul by fulfilling his duty, and of a woman who found her strength in exile. A narrative where broken hearts can heal, where second chances shine like stars in the darkest night, and where true love can conquer even the most powerful thrones. From where do you accompany us on this journey through time? I would love to know from what corner of the world you listen to this story that is about to unfold before you. If this narrative moves you as much as it excites me to tell it, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like so that more souls may find these stories that nourish the spirit. Year 1387, Kingdom of Wallachia. Land of golden mountains and ancient stone castles. In an era when destinies were written with noble blood ink and hearts were sacrificed on the altar of power, our story begins. The great hall of the royal palace of Wallachia breathed with the weight of 4 years of silence. Golden torches danced against the stone walls, casting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. The aroma of incense and white roses floated in the air, mingling with the echo of ceremonial footsteps on cold marble. King Eduardo I of Wallachia, with his 32 years and the crown that weighed more than the gold from which it was forged, stood before the polished silver mirror in his private chambers. His golden eyes' inheritance of the royal lineage reflected a melancholy that no decree could erase. His carefully trimmed beard framed a face where time had carved furrows of responsibilities, too heavy for a heart that still bled. His fingers, long and aristocratic, caressed the royal ring with an unconscious gesture that he had repeated thousands of times in those 4 years. Each caress was a silent lament, each touch an unspoken prayer toward a woman whose name he dared not murmur, but which resonated in every beat of his heart. Leonor. The carved oak door opened with a creak that pierced the silence like a sword. Queen Mother Isabel entered with the deadly grace of a serpent wrapped in purple silks, her silver hair gathered in a braid that seemed like a crown of ice framed, a face where beauty had given way to calculated cunning, her grey eyes cold as tempered steel, fixed on her son with the precision of an experienced archer. "Eduardo, my son," her voice had the texture of velvet over iron. "Today a new chapter is written in the history of Wallachia. Lady Caterina de Altenburg awaits in the chapel for the blessing of your betrothal." Eduardo turned slowly, as if each movement cost him years of life. The evening light filtering through the argyle-stained glass created a golden halo around his figure, but his eyes remained shadowed by an inner storm that knew no calm. "Mother," he murmured, and in that word was all the weight of a resignation that tore his soul apart. "You know that my heart—" "Your heart is a luxury that a king cannot afford," Isabel interrupted, approaching with steps that resonated like sentences. 4 years, Eduardo? 4 years without heirs? The kingdom needs continuity, and Lady Caterina is fertile like the earth after spring rain. Leonor's name floated between them like a ghost, unspoken, but present in every breath. Eduardo closed his eyes, and for an instant he could see his first wife's face, eyes green as polished emeralds, chestnut hair that fell like a silk cascade over her bare shoulders, the smile that had illuminated his world during 3 years of marriage. Leonor. His Leonor exiled when the royal physicians declared that her womb was barren as stone. Leonor who had departed on a winter dawn with a single farewell glance that had split his soul in two. Leonor who now lived in some northern village, as far from him as the stars from the ground. "And if she—" Eduardo began, but the words died, on his lips like flowers touched by frost. "She is the past," Isabel sentenced. "Lady Caterina is the future." While celebrations for the new betrothal were being prepared at the palace, 200 miles to the north, in a small village where wind whispered among the firs and wooden houses huddled like lambs seeking warmth, Leonor of Wallachia, though she no longer had the right to bear that surname, was drawing water from the communal well. Her hands, once soft as petals and adorned with ruby rings, now showed the honorable marks of work. The rough wool dress, mended but clean, replaced the imperial silks that had once been her second skin. but in her green eyes burned a flame that neither exile nor humiliation had managed to extinguish. The wind brought her the distant echo of bells tolling from the capital. It was a sound she knew well, celebration bells, royal announcements, new beginnings that for her always meant deeper endings. Mother Leonor, a childish voice, pulled her from her thoughts. A village girl with cheeks pink from the cold approached running. Father Miguel says news arrived from the capital. The king is marrying again. Leonor felt as if an iron fist closed around her heart, but her face remained serene like a marble statue that had learned not to cry. "May God bless His Majesty," she murmured, and in those words was an elegance that 4 years of exile had not managed to steal. That night, while the stars shone like tears shed by the gods on the black mantle of the sky, both Eduardo and Leonor raised their faces toward the same full moon, not knowing that soon destiny would weave its threads again to reunite what duty had separated. But what secrets did time guard? What hidden truths were about to be revealed that would forever change the course of their lives? The revelation. A week after the announcement of the royal betrothal, when the golden and purple fabric still decorated the palace halls like memories of feigned joy, a letter arrived at the royal office that would change the course of history. It was dawn and Eduardo was in his private study, surrounded by scrolls that spoke of harvests, taxes, and treaties that could not fill the void growing in his chest like a wound that refuses to heal. The golden light of the rising sun filtered through the stained glass, creating a kaleidoscope of colors on the tapestries that represented the past glories of Wallachia. The royal messenger, Tomás de Aguirre, entered with cautious steps, carrying in his hands a letter sealed with black wax and marked with the urgency that only news that changes destinies can bear. "Majesty," Tomás murmured, bowing with a reverence that seemed heavier than usual. "This letter arrived at dawn. The bearer disappeared before we could interrogate him." Eduardo took the missive with fingers that trembled imperceptibly. The seal was unknown, but something in the shape of the letters that formed his name on the envelope awakened in him a presentiment that made his skin crawl like a cold wind. Upon breaking the seal, the parchment unfolded words that he read once, twice, 3 times before his mind could fully process them. "Majesty, in the name of truth that transcends thrones and crowns, I must inform you that your first wife, Lady Leonor, did not leave Wallachia with an empty womb as was believed. In the village of Pedraboa, under the protection of the elderly midwife Matilde, grow 2 children who bear in their eyes the gold of royal blood. Pedro and Ana, 5-year-old twins, children of your marriage. The truth, like the sun, always finds a way to shine." The letter bore no signature, but at the end was a simple drawing, 2 intertwined flowers, a symbol that Eduardo remembered seeing embroidered on the cloak that Leonor wore on their wedding day. The world stopped. The air became thick as honey, and Eduardo's heart beat with such force that he feared the sound would wake the entire palace. His hands trembled like leaves in the wind as he reread each word, each letter, as if they were sacred, runes that might vanish if he didn't memorize them perfectly. Children, his children, twins who had been breathing, laughing, growing away from him for 5 years. He rose so abruptly that the royal chair fell backward with a crash that resonated like thunder. His steps took him to the highest stained glass window of the tower, from where he could see the northern mountains that rose like sleeping giants on the horizon. "Tomás," his voice sounded hoarse as if he hadn't spoken in years. "Prepare the most discreet retinue. We depart north within an hour." "Majesty," Tomás blinked, confused. "And the betrothal to Lady Caterina and the Queen Mother." Eduardo turned, and in his golden eyes was a determination that hadn't shone for 4 years. It was as if a part of himself, which had been sleeping in the depths of his soul, had awakened with the force of an ancestral dragon. "Tell them I'm inspecting the northern borders. Tell them whatever is necessary. But we go to seek the truth." While the royal retinue prepared in the silence of dawn 200 miles away, in a small wooden house where smoke rose like prayers from the chimney, Leonor was braiding the chestnut hair of a 5-year-old girl whose green eyes were the exact reflection of her own. "Ana, my little one," Leonor murmured with a voice soft as silk, "why do you run so much through the fields? You'll ruin your dress." The girl Anna smiled with a mischief that seemed to illuminate the entire dwelling. Her face delicate as a porcelain. Flower had the same natural elegance that had made Leonor the most beautiful woman at court. "Because I have to catch Pedro, mother. He says he can reach the river before me, but it's not true." From the corner of the room, a boy of the same age, but with a seriousness that seemed too mature for his years, looked up from the wooden pieces he was carving with a small knife. Pedro had golden eyes like dawn, and in the way he held his head was an innate dignity that spoke of noble blood running through his veins. "Ana always wins," Pedro murmured, and although his words were simple, there was in them a fraternal protection that moved the heart. "She's fast as the wind." Leonor watched them, and as every day for 5 years felt a knot in her throat, seeing in her children the traits of the man she had loved with every fiber of her being. In Ana she saw her own determination, but in Pedro she recognized Eduardo's noble gaze, that way of observing the world as if he were responsible for protecting it. She had never spoken to them of their father. How to explain to two innocent creatures that their father was a king who didn't know of their existence? How to tell them they had been born of the purest love, but that the world would consider them bastards? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Matilda, the elderly midwife who had helped her during the most difficult birth of her life, both physically and emotionally. "Leonor, my daughter," Matilda murmured, her eyes bright with concern. "They saw horsemen on the royal road. They're coming toward the village." Leonor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern cold. Something in the wind had changed, as if destiny had decided it was time for hidden truths to come to light. But was she prepared to face the man who had been her entire life and was now only a memory that she guarded like a secret treasure in her heart? The reunion, the sound of hooves against the frozen earth, echoed through the entire village of Pedroboa, like a war drum announcing the end of an era. Leonor peered through the half-open wooden window, and her heart stopped when she recognized the royal banners that fluttered in the wind like golden promises. At the head of the retinue, riding a black steed that seemed to emerge from legends, came a man whose presence filled the entire landscape. Even after 4 years, even with a fuller beard and the lines of responsibility carved more deeply into his face, Leonor would have recognized that silhouette among 1,000. Eduardo, her Eduardo. The twins who had been playing by the fireplace approached their mother upon sensing the tension that emanated from her like heat from a fire. "Mother," Pedro murmured with that intuition that seemed too developed for his 5 years, "why are you afraid?" Leonor crouched down to her children's height, and with hands that trembled slightly, she caressed the faces that were her greatest treasure in this world. "I'm not afraid, my little ones. But important visitors will come, and I want you to stay close to me, all right?" Ana, with the bravery she had inherited from both parents, nodded with determination. But Pedro, with his golden eyes that seemed to see beyond words, studied his mother's face as if trying to decipher a mystery. The knocks on the door came 3 minutes later. They weren't violent knocks, but each one resonated in Leonor's chest like an accelerated heartbeat. She smoothed her rough wool dress, arranged her hair that she now wore in a simple braid, and with a dignity that 4 years of exile had not managed to break, went to open the door. Eduardo was there just 3 steps away, and the air between them, filled with 4 years of silence, unspoken words, tears shed in solitude. He had grown in presence and authority, but in his golden eyes she saw the same vulnerability that had made her fall in love when they were both young, and believed that love could conquer any obstacle. "Leonor," he murmured, and her name on Eduardo's lips sounded like a prayer, like a lament, like a caress that had waited 4 years to be given. "Majesty," she responded with a bow that was technically correct, but carried in its coldness all the pain of a separation that had shattered her soul. Eduardo's eyes traveled over his first wife's face like a thirsty man who finds water after walking through the desert. She continued to be beautiful, but it was a beauty tempered by suffering and enriched by a strength she hadn't had at court. Her hands, now marked by work, bore no rings, but they retained the natural elegance that had distinguished her among all the ladies of nobility. "May I enter?" Eduardo asked, and in his voice was a humility that contrasted strangely with the royal authority he carried like a second skin. Leonor stepped aside, and when Eduardo entered the small wooden house, the space seemed to shrink and expand at the same time. His presence filled every corner, but not in an oppressive way, rather as if he had returned to a place to which he belonged. It was then that he saw them. Pedro and Ana stood by the fireplace holding hands in an instinctive gesture of mutual protection. Ana with her green eyes identical to her mother's and a defiant posture that spoke of an indomitable spirit. Pedro, with those golden eyes that were a perfect mirror of his own, observing him with a seriousness that cut the king's breath short. The world stopped. Time became thick as honey, and Eduardo felt as if a part of himself that had been lost for years had just found its way back home. "My God," he murmured, and the words came from him like a broken whisper. They are my children," Leonor interrupted, and in her voice was a protective ferocity that would have made an entire army retreat. "Our children." Eduardo approached slowly, as if he feared that a sudden movement might make these creatures who clearly carried his blood in their veins disappear. He knelt at the twins' height, and his eyes filled with tears he had held back for 4 years. "Pedro," he murmured, as if the name were sacred. "Ana." Ana, with the natural curiosity of childhood, stepped forward. Her green eyes studied the stranger's face with an intensity that painfully reminded him of her mother. "Are you the king?" she asked, with a voice clear as crystal bells. Eduardo nodded, unable to look away from those eyes that were so familiar and so new at the same time. "Yes, little one, I am the king." Pedro, more cautious, remained where he was, but his golden gaze didn't leave Eduardo's face. There was in him a silent evaluation, as if he were measuring the man before him with a standard that only he knew. "Mother says the king lives very far away," Pedro finally murmured. "Why did you come here?" The question, simple and innocent, pierced Eduardo's heart like a sword. How to explain to a 5-year-old child that he had lived without knowing of their existence? How to tell him that each of those 5 years had been a void that he now understood why he couldn't fill? "I came because—" Eduardo looked at Leonor, seeking in her green eyes some guidance, some sign of how to proceed. "I came because my heart told me there was something very important here." Leonor approached and placed her hands protectively on her children's shoulders. The gesture was defensive, but Eduardo could see in the tension of her muscles that she, too, was fighting against emotions that threatened to overflow. "Why didn't you tell me?" Eduardo began, standing to face her. "Tell you what?" Leonor's voice broke slightly, but recomposed itself with the speed of a woman who had learned to be strong. "That I was pregnant when you exiled me. That your doctors were wrong, that for 4 years I raised your heirs in exile, while you planned to marry another woman." The pain in her voice was so palpable that Eduardo felt as if each word were a physical wound. The twins, sensing the tension between the adults, moved closer to their mother. "I didn't know," Eduardo murmured, and in his voice was a desperation that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "Leonor, you must believe me. If I had known—" "What would you have done?" she interrupted. "Would you have defied your mother? Would you have put the kingdom's stability at risk for a barren wife?" The words floated between them like autumn, leaves laden with all the bitterness and pain of a separation that had shattered 2 hearts and left scars that might never heal completely. But in the twins' eyes, who watched the exchange with the instinctive wisdom of children, there was something more. There was hope, there was curiosity, and there was the beginning of a recognition that transcended words. Could the love that had once united Eduardo and Leonor be reborn from the ashes of pain? And what would that mean for 2 children who were about to discover that the world was much more complicated and much more wonderful than they had imagined? The return to the palace. The news reached the palace of Wallachia like a winter storm. Queen Mother Isabel had dispatched an armed guard north with specific orders to bring Eduardo back with or without his consent. The court spies, faithful to their survival instinct, had reported that the king had been absent for 3 days without satisfactory explanation. In the small house of Pedroboa, Leonor packed the few belongings that had defined her life in exile. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency, but her heart beat with the disordered rhythm of one who knows they are about to cross a threshold from which there is no return. Eduardo, who had spent the night at the village inn to maintain appearances, arrived at dawn with his face marked by a sleepless night and decisions that had changed the course of his life. "We must leave now," he murmured, watching as Leonor carefully folded the twins' small dresses. "My mother has sent soldiers." Leonor didn't look up, but her hand stopped for an instant over a woven blanket that Anna used for sleeping. "And if I don't want to go," she asked, with a voice that tried to sound firm but trembled like a leaf in the wind. "And if I prefer my children to grow up free instead of being pawns in the court's power games?" Eduardo approached, and his presence filled the small space with an energy that was both familiar and strange. When he spoke, his voice had the texture of velvet over steel. "Leonor, look at me." She raised her green eyes, and in them, Eduardo saw all the suffering of 4 years of separation. But he also saw something more. He saw the love that had never died, that had survived exile, humiliation, solitude, like a flame that refuses to be extinguished. "Our children are princes of Wallachia," Eduardo continued. "They have a right to their inheritance, to their place in the world. But more than that," his voice broke slightly, "I have a right to know them, and they have a right to know their father." At that moment, Pedro and Anna appeared in the doorway. They had been listening with that capacity children have to perceive when adult conversations will change their lives forever. "Are we going to live in a castle?" Anna asked, with a mixture of excitement and fear that made Leonor's heart contract. Pedro, more observant, approached his mother and took her hand with an instinctive protection that contrasted with his young age. "Do you want to go, mother?" The question, simple and direct, contained all the complexity of a decision that would affect not only their lives, but the future of an entire kingdom. Leonor knelt before her children, and when she spoke, her voice had the clarity of one who had found their truth. "I want you to know your father. I want you to know where you come from, who you are. But I also want you to always remember that the place doesn't make the heart noble, but actions do." The journey back to the capital was a strange procession, as if destiny itself were rewriting a story that had begun badly. Eduardo rode alongside the coach where Leonor and the twins traveled, and each mile covered seemed to undo a part of the pain he had carried for 4 years. The twins, with the marvelous adaptability of childhood, had begun asking questions about the castle, about the horses, about why Eduardo wore an invisible crown that Pedro swore he could see shining around his head. It was Anna who, with the direct curiosity that characterized her, asked what everyone had been thinking: "Why didn't you live with us before?" Eduardo felt as if each word were a small dagger piercing his heart. He looked at Leonor, seeking guidance, and she nodded slightly, giving him permission to answer. "Because I thought your mother and I couldn't have children," he responded with an honesty that hurt. "And when I learned I was wrong, many years had already passed." Pedro, with the seriousness that characterized him, processed the answer with the intensity of a miniature philosopher. "But now you know we can exist." The question, formulated with the impeccable logic of a 5-year-old child, drew a smile from Eduardo that was the first genuine smile he had had in 4 years. "Yes, Pedro. Now I know you exist, and it's the most wonderful thing that has happened to me in life." When the palace towers appeared on the horizon like golden stone giants, Leonor felt a knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was pure fear, fear for her children, fear of what returning to the place where she had been humiliated would represent, fear of facing Isabel, the woman who had orchestrated her downfall. But when Eduardo extended his hand to help her down from the coach in the palace's main courtyard, and when she saw how Pedro and Anna marveled at the magnificence of their ancestral home, she knew she had made the right decision. The great vestibule. Doors opened like the jaws of an ancestral dragon, and there, waiting with the rigid posture of a marble statue, stood Queen Mother Isabel. Her grey eyes travelled over the small retinue with a coldness that could freeze blood in veins. They stopped briefly on Leonor with a contempt that was like ice on steel, but when they saw the twins, something changed in her expression. Pedro and Anna instinctively approached their mother, but their golden and green eyes rose to study the imposing woman, who was clearly someone very important in this place of wonders and mysteries. "So," Isabel murmured, and her voice had the texture of poisoned silk, "these are the bastards who intend to threaten Wallachia's stability." The insult floated in the air like a venomous serpent, but before Leonor could respond, it was Pedro who stepped forward. With a dignity that was surprising in someone so young, he looked directly into Isabel's eyes and spoke with a clear, firm voice. "My mother taught us that people who insult children are those who fear their own smallness." The silence that followed was so profound that one could hear the echo of servants' footsteps in the upper galleries. Isabel blinked, clearly surprised by the direct response and the child's lack of intimidation. Eduardo, feeling a wave of paternal pride that threatened to overflow him, approached and placed a protective hand on Pedro's shoulder. "Mother," he said, and in his voice was an authority he hadn't shown in years. "I present to you Pedro and Ana. Of Wallachia, my children and your grandchildren, I will recognize them as legitimate heirs tomorrow at dawn." The challenge had been thrown. The pieces of the royal chessboard had moved, and in the heart of the palace that had once been her home, Leonor knew that the most difficult battle of her life was about to begin. But what dark forces were mobilizing in the shadows of the court, and what price would they all have to pay for this second chance that destiny had granted them? The conspiracy forms. In the eastern wing apartments of the palace, where the windows faced the gardens she had once designed for Leonor, the former queen found herself braiding Anna's hair while Pedro carved small wooden figures by the fireplace. The room, which had remained closed for 4 years, had regained life with a speed that seemed miraculous. Leonor had insisted on dressing her children in the simple clothes they had brought from Pedraboa. Nobility, she had told them, doesn't reside in silks, but in actions. But even in their rough wool dresses, Pedro and Ana radiated a presence that made the servants stop to look at them with reverence. In the main great hall, where tapestries told the glories of 500 years of Wallachia's history, a meeting was taking place that would determine a kingdom's future. Queen Mother Isabel occupied her usual place with Lady Caterina de Altenburg to her right, and Dom Rodrigo de Wallachia, Isabel's nephew, to her left. Lady Caterina was a 28-year-old woman, beautiful in the cold way that characterizes winter roses. Her platinum blonde hair was gathered in an elaborate braid that looked like a crown, and her blue eyes had the hardness of eternal ice. She had come to Wallachia expecting to become queen, and the appearance of Leonor and the twins threatened not only her future, but her pride. Dom Rodrigo, with his 28 years, and ambition running through his veins like hot blood, had seen in Eduardo's marriage to Caterina the opportunity to get closer to the throne. As Isabel's nephew and Eduardo's second cousin, he had cultivated for years the idea that in the absence of direct heirs, he could be next in the line of succession. "It's obvious," Caterina murmured, with a voice that had the texture of honey over poison, "that these children are bastards. What proof do we have that they're really Eduardo's children?" Isabel drummed her fingers on the armchair's arm, creating a rhythm that sounded like a countdown toward disaster. "The boy's eyes are indisputably of the royal lineage," she admitted reluctantly. "But legal recognition is another matter. Eduardo is letting his emotions cloud his judgment." Rodrigo leaned forward in his seat with the grace of a predator who had found a weakness in his prey. "Aunt, with due respect, wouldn't it be prudent to investigate more deeply the circumstances of these children's birth? Bastards have destroyed kingdoms before. Legitimacy must be unquestionable." His words floated in the air like poisonous spores, sowing doubts that would grow like weeds in fertile soil. At that moment, Eduardo entered the hall with the authority that had been sleeping for 4 years, but now awakened like a lion that remembered its power. His step echoed on the marble with a firmness that made conversation stop instantly. "There will be no more investigations," he declared, and his voice had the texture of tempered steel. "Pedro and Ana are my children. I recognize them, accept them, and tomorrow they will be officially proclaimed as heirs to the throne of Wallachia." Lady Caterina stood with a grace that couldn't hide the fury burning in her blue eyes. "Eduardo," she murmured, and in her voice was a calculated sweetness that contrasted with the storm in her eyes, "I understand your emotion, at discovering these children, but as your betrothed, I must express my concerns about the kingdom's stability." Eduardo looked at her with a coldness that made the hall's temperature seem to drop several degrees. "Lady Caterina," he responded, with a courtesy that was more insulting than any rudeness, "our betrothal was a political agreement. Now that I have legitimate heirs, that agreement lacks purpose." The silence that followed was so dense it could be cut with a sword. Caterina paled as if she had received a physical slap, but the humiliation in her eyes quickly transformed into something much more dangerous, a thirst for revenge. "Legitimate," Rodrigo murmured with the false innocence of a serpent preparing to strike. "Cousin, wouldn't it be prudent to officially confirm that these children are really the product of your marriage with the former queen?" The pause. Before mentioning Leonor was deliberate, loaded with all the contempt that could be wrapped in a silence. Eduardo turned to his cousin with a slowness that was more threatening than any sudden movement. "Are you questioning my word, Rodrigo?" "Of course not." Rodrigo raised his hands in a gesture of surrender that fooled no one. "I only suggest that for the kingdom's good, all formalities should be fulfilled. A recognition ceremony, testimonies of the birth circumstances." "The only testimonies I need," Eduardo interrupted, "are my own eyes and my own heart." Isabel, who had been observing the exchange with the patience of a spider at the center of its web, finally spoke. "Eduardo, my son, legitimacy isn't just an emotional matter, it's a legal, political, dynastic matter. If these children are going to inherit the throne, the kingdom must have absolute certainty of their lineage." Eduardo looked at his mother, and in his golden eyes was a determination she hadn't seen since he was a child, and refused to eat until they allowed him to free a caged bird. "Mother, I'll speak clearly so there are no misunderstandings. Pedro and Ana are my children. Leonor is and always was the only woman I truly loved, and if anyone in this court has problems with these truths, they can present their objections formally or seek accommodation elsewhere." The words resonated in the hall like war bells. The lines had been drawn, the sides had been defined, and everyone present knew they were at the threshold of a battle that would determine not only the dynasty's future, but the very soul of the kingdom of Wallachia. That night, while Pedro slept, embracing a small wooden figure representing a warhorse, and Ana dreamed of golden gardens and princess dresses in the palace shadows, threads were being woven of a conspiracy that threatened to destroy the happiness that had just been reborn. But true love, as Leonor had learned during 4 years of exile, is stronger than all the world's conspiracies. The question was, would it be strong enough to protect 2 innocent children from the poison that was already beginning to spread through the corridors of power? The kidnapping. Midnight had fallen over the palace of Wallachia like a black mantle embroidered with silver stars. In the eastern wing, where Leonor and the twins now resided, the silence was deep but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that precedes storms, charged with omens that make sensitive hearts race without apparent reason. Leonor had awakened with that inexplicable restlessness that mothers know well, that ancestral sensation that tells them when their children are in danger. She approached the adjoining room where Pedro and Ana slept, but upon softly opening the door, she found the beds empty. A cold that had nothing to do with the night's temperature seized her body. The blankets were disheveled as if the children had been awakened abruptly. On Pedro's pillow was a note written in elegant handwriting. "If you want to see the bastards again, keep silent until dawn. Some truths are too dangerous for the kingdom's stability." Leonor felt as if the ground opened beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she reread the note, trying to understand who in the palace would be capable of such evil. But the answer came to her mind with the terrible clarity of a revelation. Only someone with access to the royal chambers, someone with enough authority to move through the palace without being questioned. Without hesitation, she ran barefoot through the marble corridors toward Eduardo's chambers. Her bare feet echoed like urgent whispers on the cold stone, and her white nightgown floated behind her like the wings of a desperate angel. She knocked on the door with an urgency that immediately awakened the king. Eduardo opened with disheveled hair and eyes still clouded by sleep, but cleared completely upon seeing the terror on Leonore's face. "The children," she murmured, and her voice broke like crystal against stone. "They took our children." Eduardo needed no further explanations. In seconds he had dressed and was reading the note with a fury that transformed his face into a mask of lethal determination. "Rodrigo," he growled, and the name left his lips like a curse. Together, they traversed the palace, but not as king and ex-queen, but as two desperate parents united by a love that transcended titles and protocols. Eduardo knew every secret corridor, every hidden staircase that Rodrigo could have used to remove the children from the palace. It was in the ancient dungeons, now used as wine cellars, where they found the first clues. A rope that still retained the warmth of having been recently used, and more importantly, a small piece of fabric from Anna's dress caught on a rough stone. "They're heading toward the northern forest," Eduardo murmured, studying the marks on the ground with the experience of one who had hunted in these lands since childhood. Rodrigo knows the abandoned hunting cabins. As they entered the forest under the full moon's silver light, Leonore felt a mixture of terror and fury that made her tremble. But alongside that fury was something more. There was the absolute certainty that she would fight all of hell to recover her children. "Eduardo," she murmured, as they advanced among the ancestral trees. "What if they've hurt them?" Eduardo stopped and took her hands in his. In the moonlight, his golden eyes shone with a determination that would have terrified any enemy. "If they've touched a single hair on their heads," he murmured, with a voice that sounded like the contained roar of a dragon, "Rodrigo will know a fury that will make the legends of royal vengeance seem like children's tales." 2 miles away in a hunter's cabin that hadn't been used in years, Pedro and Ana sat in a corner holding hands and observing their captors with a mixture of fear and defiance that would have made their parents proud. Dom Rodrigo paced before them like a caged wolf, while 2 hired mercenaries stood guard at the door. His plan was simple but effective: keep the children hidden until Eduardo, desperate, agreed to disavow their legitimacy in exchange for their safety. "Why did you bring us here?" Ana asked with that direct bravery that characterized her young age. "My mother will be very worried." Rodrigo stopped before her, and in his eyes was a coldness that violently contrasted with his false smile. "Little one, you're only here to help your father understand certain political realities." Pedro, who had been observing in silence with the intensity that characterized him, spoke with a voice that was surprisingly firm for a 5-year-old child. "My mother says that people who hurt children are cowards who are afraid to face adults." The direct response and the complete lack of intimidation in the boy's voice made Rodrigo feel an irritation he hadn't expected. He had underestimated the character of these little ones who carried royal blood in their veins. It was then that the sound of approaching footsteps reached the cabin. Eduardo had found their trail, and he came accompanied not only by Leonore but by a small guard of loyal soldiers who had sworn to protect the royal family with their lives. "Rodrigo," Eduardo's voice resonated from outside the cabin with the authority of one trained to command armies. "Come out and face the consequences of your treason." Inside the cabin, Pedro and Ana felt a wave of relief upon recognizing their father's voice. Ana stood with determination. "Daddy," she shouted, using that word for the first time, and her voice pierced the wooden walls like a golden arrow. "We're here." Rodrigo paled upon realizing his plan had failed. The mercenaries, hearing they were surrounded by the royal guard, began exchanging nervous glances. Being accomplices in the kidnapping of royal heirs was a crime paid with life. The cabin door opened with a crash that sounded like final judgment. Eduardo entered like a storm of justice, followed by Leonore, who headed immediately to her children with a desperation that would have melted the coldest heart. "Are you all right?" Leonore murmured, embracing Pedro and Ana as if she feared they might disappear. "Did they hurt you?" "We're fine, Mother," Pedro responded, but in his golden eyes was a new understanding of the world that had aged him years in a single night. Eduardo approached Rodrigo with a slowness that was more terrifying than any violence. His cousin, who had always been skilled with words and manipulation, now found himself facing the pure fury of a father who had been about to lose his children. "Cousin," Eduardo murmured, and in his voice was a coldness that could freeze blood. "You have committed treason against the crown and attempted against the safety of my heirs. Do you have anything to say before I pronounce your sentence, Rodrigo?" With the desperation of one who sees his future crumbling, attempted one last manipulation. Eduardo, all this was to protect the kingdom. "These bastards—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Eduardo struck him with a force that sent Rodrigo to the ground, and when he spoke, his voice had the texture of molten lava. "Never ever call my children bastards again." The echo of those words resonated in the cabin like a royal sentence, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed the moment when Eduardo of Wallachia had stopped being simply a king and had become something much more powerful. He had become a father who would protect his family against any threat wherever it came from. But what consequences would this night have for the kingdom's future, and what justice awaited those who had dared threaten the throne's heirs? The trial and proclamation. The dawn of the following day rose over Wallachia like a new beginning. But in the palace's great audience hall, the air was charged with the electricity that precedes great storms. The white marble columns seemed like silent soldiers awaiting orders, and the stained glass projected rainbows of colors on the floor where a traitor's fate would be decided. Eduardo, dressed in full royal regalia for the first time in 4 years, occupied the golden dragon throne that had been forged by Wallachia's first king 3 centuries ago. To his right, in a chair that had been brought especially for the occasion, sat Leonor, also dressed in the purple silks that corresponded to her position as Queen Mother. Her green eyes shone with a dignity that exile had not managed to break. Pedro and Ana, now dressed in clothes befitting Wallachia's princes, sat in small golden armchairs. Pedro wore a royal blue tunic that enhanced his golden eyes, while Ana wore a green silk dress that made her look like a small goddess of spring. Both observed the proceedings with the seriousness that children adopt when they understand they are witnessing something historic. Queen Mother Isabel occupied her traditional place, but for the first time in years, she wasn't the one controlling the situation. Her face, usually a mask of perfect control, showed the tension lines of one who sees power slipping from her hands like sand through fingers. Rodrigo de Wallachia was brought before the tribunal in chains, but with his head held high. Even in defeat, he tried to maintain the arrogance that had been his distinctive mark. His eyes swept the hall, stopping briefly on Isabel, as if expecting some kind of last-minute intervention. Eduardo stood, and the silence that extended through the hall was so profound that one could hear the echo of a water drop falling in some distant fountain. When he spoke, his voice resonated with the authority of 500 years of royal lineage. "Dom Rodrigo de Wallachia," he began, and each word fell like a hammer on justice's anvil. "You have been found guilty of treason against the crown, kidnapping of royal heirs, and conspiracy to destabilize the kingdom. These are charges traditionally paid with life." A murmur ran through the galleries where the court nobles had congregated. Some loyal to Eduardo nodded with approval. Others, who had hoped to benefit from Rodrigo's ambitions, exchanged nervous glances. Rodrigo raised his head with a last flash of defiance. "Eduardo, cousin, everything I did was for Wallachia's good. These children, regardless of their blood, are a threat to the stability we've built over years." Eduardo descended the throne steps with a slowness that made each step resonate like a countdown. He stopped before Rodrigo, so close he could see the fear his cousin tried to hide behind his mask of arrogance. "Wallachia's good," Eduardo murmured, and in his voice was a coldness that would have made an army retreat. "Or the good of your own ambitions?" Rodrigo opened his mouth to respond, but Eduardo raised a hand to silence him. "For years," the king continued, "I believed justice was a matter of laws and traditions. But last night, when I thought I might lose my children, I understood that true justice comes from the heart." He turned to the hall, and when he spoke, his voice rose so all could hear every word. "Dom Rodrigo de Wallachia, for your crimes against the crown and against my family, I condemn you to perpetual exile in the fortress of Dragova in the northern mountains. There you will have time to reflect on the consequences of treason and excessive ambition." A murmur of surprise ran through the hall. The fortress of Dragova was known as the place where fallen nobles were sent to spend the rest of their lives. In isolation, it was a civil death, but not physical. Isabel stood with a grace that couldn't hide her shock. "Eduardo, my son, isn't this sentence too lenient?" Eduardo turned to his mother, and in his eyes was a resolution she had never seen. "Mother, I've learned that true strength isn't in destroying our enemies, but in demonstrating that we are better than them." Rodrigo, who had expected death, seemed to waver upon hearing the sentence. Perpetual exile was in many ways worse than a quick execution. It was a slow death day by day, surrounded by mountains that would become the walls of a natural prison. But it was Pedro who spoke next, with that clear voice he had inherited from both parents. "Father, does this mean Mr. Rodrigo won't be able to try to hurt children again?" Eduardo approached his son and knelt at his height so their eyes were on the same level. "It means, Pedro, that sometimes justice is also protection, and that a king must be strong not only to punish, but also to forgive when necessary." Anna, with the intuition that characterized her, added, "And does this mean we don't have to be afraid anymore?" Leonor stepped forward and took her children's hands in hers. "It means, my little one, that your family will always protect you whatever happens." Rodrigo was led from the hall between guards, and as he left, Isabel followed him with her gaze. Her nephew had been a pawn in her power games, but now that he had fallen, she knew she would have to recalculate her entire strategy. With Rodrigo out of play, only one obstacle remained. To Eduardo and Leonor's happiness, Lady Caterina de Altenburg, who had remained silent throughout the trial, but whose blue eyes shone with a cold fury that promised this story hadn't ended yet. Eduardo turned to the hall full of nobles and courtiers, and when he spoke, his voice had the resonance of great historical declarations. "And now, people of Wallachia, it is time to rectify an error that has lasted too long. Pedro and Anna of Wallachia are officially proclaimed as legitimate heirs to the throne. Their names will be written in the dynasty's golden book, and their place in the line of succession is assured by right of blood and royal decree." The hall exploded in a murmur of voices that gradually became applause. The loyal nobles bowed in reverence to the new heirs, while some others exchanged calculating glances. But for Pedro and Anna, who had gone in a week from being village children to kingdom heirs, all that mattered was that they finally had a complete family. And for Eduardo and Leonor, it was the first step toward rebuilding a love that had survived exile, separation, and power conspiracies. However, in the Western Wing apartments, Lady Caterina was writing an urgent letter addressed to her father, the Duke of Altenburg. Because if she had learned anything at court, it was that one lost battle doesn't mean a finished war. What new storms were brewing on the horizon, and would love be enough to protect this family that had fought so hard to reunite? As Caterina's departure and family reconciliation. 3 days after Rodrigo's trial, when the golden and purple fabric still decorated the palace halls like memories of feigned joy, the palace of Wallachia had acquired a different atmosphere. It was as if it had awakened from a 4-year dream, and now the corridors resonated with children's laughter and the murmur of conversations not laden with political intrigue. In the Eastern Wing gardens, where the roses had been replanted following the original design Eduardo had created for Leonor in the early days of their marriage, the former queen was teaching Anna to embroider, while Pedro practiced writing with a quill that seemed too large for his small hands. Leonor had subtly changed since her return. Royal silks had replaced rough wool, but she wore them with a naturalness she hadn't had in her youth. Exile had taught her the value of simple things, and now that she had recovered the complex ones, she appreciated them with a depth she hadn't possessed before. "Mother," Anna murmured, concentrating on creating small golden flowers on white fabric. "Why does Father sometimes look at us as if he can't believe we exist?" Leonor smiled, and in that smile was all the wisdom gained when one has lost everything and recovered the essential. "Because for 5 years, my little one, he didn't know, you existed. Imagine if someone told you that you have a wonderful treasure hidden somewhere but you don't know where, and suddenly one day you find it. Wouldn't you look at it too as if you couldn't believe it's real?" Pedro looked up from his writing, and in his golden eyes was that premature understanding that characterized him. "And is that why he sometimes Cries when he thinks we're not watching. The question pierced Leonore's heart like a sweet and painful arrow. Her children were more perceptive than she had imagined, capable of seeing emotions that adults believed they were hiding. Yes, Pedro, sometimes he cries because he's very happy, but also because he's sad about all the time we lost. At that moment, as if summoned by the conversation, Eduardo appeared in the garden doorway. He wore simple clothes without royal regalia, and in his hand was a small wooden horse carved with exquisite detail. "May I interrupt this artist's meeting?" he asked with a smile that completely transformed his face, making him look younger, more like the man Leonore had fallen in love with years ago. Anna dropped her embroidery and ran to him with that spontaneous joy that only children who feel completely safe and loved possess. "Daddy, what did you bring?" Eduardo knelt at her height and showed her the carved horse whose mane was painted a gold that shone in the sun. "It's for you, princess. I carved it last night when I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about how fortunate I am." Pedro approached with the cautious curiosity that characterized him, and Eduardo handed him another object, a small wooden sword, perfectly balanced with the hilt wrapped in soft leather. "And for you, Prince, because every future king must learn that true strength comes from the heart, not from the blade." The twins received their gifts with the solemnity that presents made with paternal love deserved, but it was when they moved away to play that Eduardo and Leonore found themselves alone for the first time since her return. The silence that extended between them wasn't uncomfortable, but charged with everything they had lived, lost, and recovered. Eduardo sat on the marble bench next to Leonore, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but maintaining the respectful distance that years of separation had made necessary. "Leonore," he finally murmured, and her name on Eduardo's lips sounded like a long-awaited prayer. "I know there are things we must talk about, things that aren't fixed just with royal decrees." Leonore continued embroidering, but her hands moved with less certainty than before. When she spoke, her voice had the texture of silk over melancholy. "Eduardo, we've changed, both of us. I'm not the same woman who left 4 years ago, and you're not the same man who let me go." Eduardo felt a stab of pain hearing the truth so clearly expressed. But alongside the pain was something more. There was hope. "It's true," he admitted. "Exile made you stronger, more independent, and solitude taught me the value of what I had lost. But Leonore..." He turned to her, and in his golden eyes was a vulnerability that cost him to show, "What I feel for you hasn't changed. If anything, it's become deeper." Leonore left her embroidery on her lap and finally looked at him directly. In her green eyes were contained tears, but there was also a warmth that had been absent for 4 years. "I love you too, Eduardo. I never stopped loving you, not even when the pain was so great I thought it would kill me. But love doesn't erase the past. It doesn't erase the decisions we made, the time we lost, the wounds that haven't completely healed yet." Eduardo extended his hand, slowly giving her time to reject it if she so desired. When she didn't pull away, he took her hand in his, and it was as if 2 pieces of a puzzle that had been separated for too long finally found their place. "Then let's build something new," Eduardo murmured. "Let's not try to go back to what we were, but become what we can be now with everything we've learned, with all the wisdom that pain gave us." Pedro and Anna, who had been playing nearby, approached, as if they had sensed that something important was happening. Anna climbed onto her mother's lap, while Pedro stood next to Eduardo with a hand on his father's shoulder. "Does this mean we're going to be a real family?" Anna asked with that capacity. Children have to go directly to the heart of important matters. Eduardo and Leonore looked at each other, and in that look, they communicated more than they could have expressed with 1,000 words. At that moment, surrounded by their children's laughter and the aroma of roses blooming in the garden they had designed together in happier times, both knew they had found their way back to each other. "Yes, my little one," Leonore murmured, embracing her daughter. "We're going to be a real family." But in the palace's western wing, Isabel observed the scene from a high window, and in her grey eyes was a mixture of resignation and something that could have been against all expectations, a glimpse of maternal satisfaction. Her son had found happiness, and although this meant the loss of her own power, Perhaps the time had come to accept that some battles are lost to win a more important war, the war for the family's soul. But what steps would follow to definitively seal this second chance that destiny had granted them, and what role would Lady Katerina play, who still remained in the palace like a reminder of plans that had crumbled? The second wedding ceremony, the Cathedral of St. Michael of Wallachia, rose against the dawn sky like a prayer of stone and crystal that had waited 500 years to witness the ceremony about to be celebrated. The bells rang with a joy that extended throughout the capital, announcing that the kingdom would have after all a happy ending to a story that had begun with tears. It wasn't a common wedding. Eduardo and Leonor had already been spouses before, God and law, but both had insisted they wanted to renew their matrimonial vows. The first time, Eduardo had said, "We married out of duty and hope. This time we marry for proven love and gained wisdom." The cathedral was filled to the last corners. Wallachia's nobles occupied the main pews, some genuinely happy for their king, others calculating how this new order would affect their own interests. But in the balconies and upper galleries, the capital's common people crowded to witness a story that had captured everyone's imagination, the story of the king who had recovered his lost love and the queen who had raised the kingdom's heirs in exile. Pedro and Ana, dressed as princes, but with the naturalness that allowed them to continue being children, occupied places of honor in the first pew. Pedro wore a blue velvet tunic with golden embroidery, representing dragon's symbol of the royal house. Ana wore a light green silk dress that made her look like a small goddess of spring with pearl flowers woven into her chestnut hair. Queen Mother Isabel, after days of silent resistance, had finally accepted her new reality. Dressed in imperial purple, she occupied her place with the dignity of one who learned that sometimes defeat can also be a form of victory. Her grey eyes observed the ceremony with a mixture of resignation and something that surprisingly seemed to be maternal pride. Lady Katerina had departed that same morning for Altenburg, taking with her a generous compensation dowry and a letter from Eduardo explaining that the heart cannot be forced by contracts, nor can true love be replaced by political convenience. Her departure had been discreet but definitive, thus closing the last chapter of ambitions that had threatened the royal family's happiness. Archbishop Damião, a 70-year-old man, whose white beard gave him the aspect of a biblical prophet, approached the altar where Eduardo waited, dressed in full royal regalia. Wallachia's golden crown rested on his chestnut hair, but in his eyes was a humility that contrasted with the magnificence of his clothes. When the cathedral's main doors opened to give passage to Leonor, a reverent silence extended throughout the building. She advanced alone down the central aisle because she had insisted that this time no one would give her away to her husband. "I'm no longer property that passes from some hands to others," she had said. "I'm a woman who chooses her companion for love." Her dress was a masterpiece of white silk embroidered with silver threads, representing stars and moons, as if she wore the very night itself. Her chestnut hair was gathered in a complex braid, adorned with pearls that had belonged to Wallachia's queens for generations. But what most impressed wasn't her physical beauty, but the serenity and strength she radiated with each step. When she reached the altar and stood next to Eduardo, both looked at each other with the intensity of those who had traveled through hell to find each other again in paradise. Archbishop Damião raised his voice, which resonated throughout the cathedral like the echo of eternity. "Beloved brothers, we are gathered here not to unite two lives, but to bless a union that has already been proven by suffering's fire and tempered by forgiveness's wisdom." His words floated in the air laden with incense and hope, while the stained glass projected rainbows of colors over the faithful's bowed heads. "Eduardo of Wallachia," the archbishop continued, "do you promise to love Leonor not only in prosperity, but also in adversity? Do you promise to protect her not only as king but as husband? Do you promise that you will never again allow duty to supersede the love you profess?" Eduardo took Leonor's hands in his, and when he spoke, his voice reached the cathedral's farthest corners. "I promise to love her with every beat of my heart, protect her with every breath of my life, and honor her as the extraordinary woman she is, I promise that the kingdom will prosper, because our love will be its strongest foundation. Leonor of Wallachia. The Archbishop turned to her. Do you promise to love Eduardo not despite his imperfections, but together with them? Do you promise to stand by his side, not only as queen but as companion? Do you promise that the forgiveness you granted will be the seed of an even deeper love? Leonor felt tears of happiness running down her cheeks when she responded with a voice clear as crystal. I promise to love him with the wisdom that pain gave me, accompany him with the strength I found in solitude, and build with him a kingdom where love is more powerful than fear. When the Archbishop declared they were united again in matrimony, the cathedral exploded in applause that extended to the exterior squares. But for Eduardo and Leonor, who kissed with the tenderness of those who learned that true love is a privilege that must be protected, the rest of the world had disappeared. Pedro and Ana approached running to the altar, and when their parents embraced them, they formed a perfect circle of family love that seemed to radiate its own light. Now we really are a family forever, Ana asked with that need for confirmation that children who have lived uncertainty possess. Forever and beyond, Eduardo responded, carrying his daughter while Leonor embraced Pedro. The celebration that followed at the palace lasted until well into the night. The gardens filled with music, dance, and a joy that seemed contagious. Nobles and commoners celebrated together because Eduardo and Leonor's story had touched something universal in the human heart, love's capacity to heal, to forgive, to begin anew. That night, when the last guests had retired and the children slept deeply in their beds, Eduardo and Leonor found themselves alone on their chamber's balcony, observing the stars that shone like blessings over their kingdom. Do you believe we'll be able to do it right this time? Leonor murmured, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. Eduardo surrounded her with his arms, and in his voice was a certainty he hadn't had in his youth. I believe we're capable of trying each day, learning from our mistakes and loving with more wisdom. And I believe that's all one can ask for in this life. While the stars watched them as silent witnesses to their recovered happiness, neither knew that their love story had begun to extend beyond Wallachia's borders, inspiring other broken hearts to believe that second chances are not only possible, but sometimes even more beautiful than first beginnings. But what did the future hold for this family that had fought so hard to be together? And how would they govern a kingdom founded not on power, but on love proven by suffering's fire? 5 years of prosperity. 5 years had passed since Eduardo and Leonor's second wedding ceremony, and the kingdom of Wallachia had flourished in ways that surpassed its inhabitants' most optimistic dreams. It was as if the true love that reigned in the palace had radiated to every corner of the territory, transforming not only laws, but the very soul of the nation. In the great council hall where political intrigues were once plotted, meetings now took place that combined traditional wisdom with revolutionary ideas. Eduardo, now 37 years old, had matured into a king who governed with his heart as much as his mind. His beard, perfectly groomed, framed a face where worry lines had been, replaced by the lines of a man who had found his purpose. Leonor, at 33, had become much more than a queen consort. She was the architect of social reforms that had transformed women's lives in the kingdom. She had established schools where girls learned not only domestic tasks, but also mathematics, letters and arts. Her chestnut hair, now with some silver strands that Eduardo kissed each morning as if they were moon threads, was gathered in a crown of braids that gave her a majestic but accessible appearance. Pedro, now 10 years old, had grown into a prince who combined royal dignity with an insatiable curiosity to know his people. He had the habit of escaping the palace disguised as a peasant to walk through the markets and talk with common folk. His golden eyes, identical to his father's, had developed a depth that spoke of a young but wise soul. Ana, also 10, had defied all expectations about what a princess should be. She had insisted on learning swordplay alongside her brother and her weapons master, declared she had a natural talent that rivaled the kingdom's best warriors. Her green eyes shone with a determination that promised that when her time came, she would be a queen no one could ignore. Queen Mother Isabel, now 62, had experienced a transformation no one could have predicted. The failure of her political manipulations had been paradoxically her liberation. Without the weight of controlling the kingdom on her shoulders, she had discovered aspects of herself she had kept hidden for decades. She had become the most devoted grandmother Pedro and Ana could have wished for, telling them stories of Wallachia's history with a passion that illuminated her grey eyes. This particular morning, the Royal Council met to discuss a report that had arrived from the Northern Territories. The reforms implemented by Eduardo and Leonor had resulted in the greatest harvest in decades, and reports spoke of villages that had grown into prosperous cities. "Majesty," the Royal Chancellor murmured, an elderly man whose white hair had witnessed 3 generations of kings. "The reports indicate that infant mortality has decreased by 40% since the maternity houses proposed by Her Majesty, the Queen, were established." Leonor smiled with that silent satisfaction that comes from seeing ideas become realities that save lives. "And what news do we have from the trade schools?" Eduardo asked, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed gesture of a man who had learned that governing didn't have to be a constant struggle. "Extraordinary Majesty, the Minister of Education," responded. "The young people who graduated last year have established workshops producing crafts that are exported to the most distant kingdoms. Wallachia is becoming synonymous with quality and beauty." Pedro, who had permission to attend these meetings as part of his royal education, raised his hand with the natural courtesy he had learned from observing his parents. "Father, could I make a suggestion?" Eduardo nodded with a smile that mixed paternal pride with respect for his son's intelligence. "Always, Pedro. Your perspective is valuable." "I've been talking with the children from the markets." Pedro began, ignoring the surprised looks from some councillors who clearly didn't approve of the heir prince mixing with common people, "and many of them dream of traveling to other kingdoms to learn trades that don't exist here. What would happen if we established an exchange program?" The suggestion generated a murmur of interest among the councillors. It was a progressive idea that would have been unthinkable under Isabel's government, but fit perfectly with Eduardo and Leonor's vision of a kingdom open to the world. "It's an excellent idea," Leonor murmured. "The children who travel will return with knowledge that will benefit the entire kingdom." While the council meeting continued with discussions about trade, agriculture, and education, in another part of the palace, Ana was having her own meeting. She had escaped from her etiquette classes to meet with Matilda, the elderly midwife who had helped at her birth, and now lived in the palace as a kind of adoptive grandmother. "Matilda," Ana murmured, sitting on the floor next to the old woman who was weaving by the window, "do you think I could someday be a queen like Mama?" Matilda, whose eyes still shone with the wisdom of one who had seen generations born and grow, smiled tenderly. "My little one, you're already special in ways your mother never was at your age. She had to learn to be strong after suffering. You're learning to be strong from joy. That will make you different, but no less extraordinary." Ana processed these words with the seriousness that characterized her important conversations. "And Pedro, do you think he'll be a good king?" "Pedro has your mother's heart and your father's mind," Matilda responded. "But more importantly, he has something no king before him has had. He grew up seeing true love as the foundation of power. That will make him a unique ruler in history." That afternoon, when royal obligations had ended, the family gathered in the private gardens for their favorite ritual outdoor dinner under the stars. It was a tradition they had established when Pedro and Ana were 5 years old, and which they had maintained without exception for 5 years. The table was set under a centennial oak that Eduardo had ordered, planted the day the twins had returned to the palace. The branches extended like protective arms over the family, and the oil lights hanging among the leaves created a magical atmosphere. "You know what?" Eduardo murmured, observing his family while serving wine for himself and Leonor and fruit juice for the children. "There are days when I have to pinch myself to make sure all this is real." Leonor took his hand across the table, with that natural gesture she had developed during years of shared happiness. "Even after 5 years, especially after 5 years," Eduardo responded. "Because now I know what it really means to have a family, to have a purpose, to govern from love instead of fear." Ana, who was building castles with breadcrumbs on her plate, looked up with a mischievous smile. "Father, Grandma Isabel says that when you were young, You were very serious, and never smiled. Eduardo laughed with that deep laughter that had replaced the melancholy of his lonely years. Your grandmother is right, but then I didn't know I had two little sons waiting to illuminate my life. Pedro, who had been observing the stars with the intensity of an astronomer, spoke without lowering his gaze from the sky. Do you think people from other kingdoms can also be as happy as us? The question, deep like all of Pedro's, made Eduardo and Leonor exchange a meaningful look. I believe, Leonor responded, that happiness isn't a privilege of kings but a right of all hearts that learn to love without fear. While the stars shone over Wallachia like silent blessings, the royal family continued their dinner surrounded by the peace that comes from knowing they had found exactly what they were destined to be. Not just a family, but an example that true love can transform not only individual hearts, but entire kingdoms. But what final lessons awaited them? And how would this extraordinary family prepare to face the future that stretched before them like a blank scroll waiting to be written with golden ink? The Golden Crowns Festival. Autumn had arrived in Masintmi, Wallachia, painting the palace gardens in golden and scarlet tones that seemed to reflect the maturity the royal family had achieved. In Eduardo's private library, where ancient manuscripts shared space with the new legal codes that had transformed the kingdom, a conversation was taking place that would mark the dynasty's future. Pedro, now 12 years old, had grown into a young man whose presence filled rooms with a natural authority that didn't need to be imposed. His golden eyes had developed the ability to see beyond appearances, a skill he had perfected during his secret excursions among the people. That afternoon, he had returned from one of those expeditions with news he considered important. "Father," Pedro murmured, sitting before the desk where Eduardo reviewed the month's reports, "I've been talking with the port merchants, and they told me interesting things about the Eastern Kingdoms." Eduardo looked up from the scrolls, always willing to listen to his son's observations. For years he had learned that Pedro's perspectives often revealed truths that official reports didn't capture. "What kind of things, son?" Pedro leaned forward, with the intensity that characterized his serious conversations. "There's a kingdom called Asturia, where the king died without male heirs and his eldest daughter is fighting to be recognized as legitimate heir. The nobles resist because they say women can't govern." Eduardo frowned, recognizing an echo of the struggles his own family had faced. "And what do you think about this?" "I think," Pedro responded with a firmness that would have made Leonor proud, "that if Anna were Wallachia's heir, she would be the best queen this kingdom could have. Why can't women elsewhere have the same opportunities?" The question resonated in the library with the weight of a truth Eduardo had been considering for months. His son had articulated something he himself had been feeling, that the changes that had transformed Wallachia could and should extend beyond their borders. At that moment, Anna entered the library with the silent grace she had developed during years of stealth practice. At 12, she had grown into a young woman whose beauty was only surpassed by her determination. Her green eyes shone with the intelligence she had inherited from her mother and the willpower she had developed on her own. "May I join this conversation that seems so important?" she asked with a smile that mixed learned diplomacy with natural curiosity. "Always, princess," Eduardo responded. "Pedro was telling me about the situation in Asturia." Anna sat on her father's armchair, a gesture of closeness she had maintained since childhood, despite her growing royal formality. "Ah, yes. I heard the court ladies talking about it. They say Princess Ilara of Asturia is very intelligent, but the nobles prefer to give the kingdom to a distant cousin just because he's a man." Eduardo surrounded his daughter with one arm, marveling as always at his children's perspicacity. "And what do you two think about this?" Pedro and Anna exchanged a look that spoke of private conversations they had had about these topics. "We believe," Anna said, "that we should invite Princess Ilara to Wallachia. Let her see how a kingdom works, where women have a voice in government. Maybe that will give her ideas for her own struggle. And besides," Pedro added, "we could establish trade relations with Asturia that benefit both kingdoms regardless of who ends up governing." Eduardo felt a wave of pride that threatened to overflow him. His children weren't only thinking beyond Wallachia's borders, but were developing a leadership vision that combined social justice with intelligent diplomacy. "Those are excellent ideas," he murmured. "Why don't we discuss them with your mother?" During dinner. That night, the royal family gathered in the private dining room, where they had shared thousands of meals that had cemented their union. Leonor, now 35, had developed a mature elegance that made her seem more like a goddess than a mortal queen. Her chestnut hair, now adorned with silver threads that Eduardo declared to be wisdom threads woven by angels, was gathered in a simple braid that enhanced her face's serenity. When Pedro and Ana presented their ideas about inviting Princess Ilara of Asturia, Leonor listened with the complete attention she gave to all important conversations with her children. "It's a fascinating proposal," she murmured delicately, cutting a piece of roasted meat. "But we must consider the political implications. Inviting a disputed heir could be interpreted as interference in Asturia's internal affairs." Eduardo nodded, but in his eyes was a spark of the same determination he had shown when he decided to recover his family. "It's true, but it could also be interpreted as a gesture of royal hospitality for a legitimate princess. Diplomacy, after all, often requires taking subtle positions." Ana, who had been reflecting while eating, raised her fork like a miniature scepter. "What if we organized an international cultural festival? We could invite representatives from many kingdoms, including Asturia. That way, it wouldn't seem like we're taking sides, but simply celebrating diversity." The suggestion generated admiring silence. Even Pedro, who rarely surprised himself with his twin sister's intelligence, looked at her with something approaching veneration. "Ana," Leonor murmured, "that's a brilliant idea. A festival that celebrates not only culture, but also women's achievements in leadership. We could call it the Golden Crowns Festival." Eduardo leaned back in his chair, observing his family with the satisfaction of one who sees that his teachings have been not only understood, but surpassed. "Then it's decided. We'll organize the first Golden Crowns Festival of Wallachia. It will be an event that not only strengthens our diplomatic relations, but also sends a clear message about our values." Pedro raised his fruit juice glass in a solemn toast to a future where wisdom matters more than blind tradition. Ana raised hers, adding, "and where merit matters more than gender." Eduardo and Leonor exchanged a look full of pride and hope before raising their own glasses. "To our children," Eduardo murmured, "who will build a better world than the one we received." "And to love," Leonor added, "which always finds a way to transform injustice into opportunity." As they toasted under the golden candlelight, none of them knew that this conversation would mark the beginning of a new era in international relations, nor that the Golden Crowns Festival would become a tradition that would endure for centuries. In the palace's western wing, Isabel observed the stars from her window with a smile that had taken years to reach her face. Her grandchildren had surpassed all her expectations, and for the first time in decades, she felt genuinely proud of the legacy she was helping to create. But time, as always, followed its inexorable course, and soon came the night when Isabel called Eduardo to her chambers for a conversation she had been postponing for months. The final conversation with Isabel. Isabel's room had the atmosphere of a place where time had slowed to become a gentle current of memories and wisdom. The walls were covered with tapestries narrating Wallachia's history, and above the fireplace hung a portrait of her late husband Eduardo's father, whose eyes seemed to observe with benevolence the changes that had transformed the kingdom. Isabel, now 64, had become a softer version of herself. Her hair, completely silver, was gathered in a simple braid that gave her the appearance of a wise grandmother rather than an imperious queen. Her grey eyes, once hard as steel, now shone with the warmth she had learned from observing her family's happiness. "Eduardo, my son," she murmured as he sat in the armchair before her, "I need to talk to you about the kingdom's future." Eduardo, who had learned to read the subtleties in his mother's voice, detected something different in her tone. It wasn't the authority of yesteryear, but something deeper. It was the urgency of one who has important things to say, and fears time might run out. "Of course, Mother. You always have my attention." Isabel took his hands in hers, and Eduardo was surprised how fragile they felt. Throughout his life he had perceived his mother as a force of nature, immutable and indestructible. Now for the first time he saw in her a woman who had aged. "I've been reflecting on my mistakes," Isabel began. "For years I believed a dynasty's strength depended on control manipulation, maintaining power above all else. It took me too long to understand I was wrong." Eduardo gently squeezed his mother's hands, surprised by this vulnerability he had never seen in her. "Mother, you were an extraordinary queen. Wallachia prospered under your regency." "Wallachia survived under my regency," Isabel corrected. "But it's prospering under your reign, and the difference is love. You and Leonor have demonstrated that a kingdom built on true love is stronger than any fortress built on fear." Her words floated in the air, laden with lavender and burning wood aromas, creating a moment of intimacy Eduardo knew he would remember his entire life. "I want to ask you a favor," Isabel continued. "When my time comes to depart, I want Pedro and Ana to remember their grandmother, not as the woman who almost destroyed their family, but as the woman who learned to love them unconditionally." Eduardo felt a knot in his throat, hearing the vulnerability in his mother's voice. "Mother, they already love you. They've seen you become the most devoted grandmother they could wish for. They've seen your transformation, and that has made them wiser and more compassionate." Isabel smiled with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. "Do you know what my greatest pride is, Eduardo? It's not having governed Wallachia for 25 years. It's having raised a son who was capable of choosing love over duty, and who is raising grandchildren who will change the world. Pedro and Jana are extraordinary," Eduardo admitted. "Sometimes they surprise me with their wisdom and compassion." "Because they grew up seeing true love as something normal," Isabel murmured. "For them, that their parents love each other, respect each other, and work together isn't exceptional, it's the rule. That will make them leaders who create a world where love is the foundation of power, not the exception." At that moment, as if summoned by the conversation, Pedro and Ana appeared in the doorway. They had come to say goodnight to their grandmother, as they did every night without exception. "Grandma," Ana murmured, approaching with the natural grace she had developed. "Are you all right? You seem sad." Isabel opened her arms to receive her grandchildren, and when they nestled at her side, her face lit up with pure happiness. "I'm not sad, my little one. I'm reflective. Sometimes when older people look back, they see both mistakes and successes, and that can make them seem melancholy." Pedro, with the perception that characterized him, studied his grandmother's face with the intensity of one seeking to understand deep truths. "Grandma Mama says mistakes are opportunities to grow. Did your mistakes make you grow?" The question, formulated with the direct innocence of a 12-year-old child, pierced Isabel's heart like an arrow of light. "Yes, Pedro. My mistakes taught me that power without love is empty, that control without compassion is fragile, and that true strength comes from the capacity to love and be loved." Ana nestled closer to her grandmother, with that need for physical closeness that characterizes children when they feel adults need comfort. "We love you, Grandma, even if you made mistakes before we were born." Isabel felt tears running down her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude, not sadness. She had lived long enough to see that love can indeed redeem any mistake, heal any wound, and transform any heart. "And I love you more than words can express," she murmured, kissing her grandchildren's heads. "You are proof that true love can create miracles." Eduardo observed the scene with a mixture of emotions that threatened to overflow him. Seeing his mother, who had once been so hard and implacable, converted into this tender and wise grandmother, was confirmation that people can change, grow, and find redemption, no matter how lost they may have been. That night, when Pedro and Ana had retired to their rooms, Eduardo stayed with his mother until very late, sharing memories, plans for the future, and the kind of deep conversation that's only possible between parents and children who have learned to see beyond roles and recognize each other's humanity. When he finally said goodbye, Isabel took his hand one last time. "Eduardo, promise me something. Whatever happens in the future, never forget that the love you and Leonor share is the greatest treasure you can bequeath to your children." "I promise, Mother." As Eduardo returned to his chambers, where Leonor awaited him with a smile that was like a lighthouse in the night, He didn't know he had just lived one of the last deep conversations he would have with his mother. But he knew those words would remain engraved in his heart forever, like a compass that would guide him in years to come. The joint heirs. 3 years had passed since that intimate conversation between Eduardo and Isabel, and the kingdom of Wallachia had become something that surpassed even its ruler's most optimistic visions. The first Golden Crowns Festival had been such an extraordinary success that it was now celebrated annually, attracting representatives from more than 20 kingdoms and establishing Wallachia as a center of progressive diplomacy. Princess Ilara of Asturia had not only attended the festival, but had found in Wallachia both inspiration and practical support for her cause. With the discreet but effective help of Leonor's diplomacy and Pedro's wisdom, she had managed to secure her throne and had become the first queen by right in Asturia's history. In the palace's great hall, where portraits of women leaders from around the known world now hung, a ceremony was taking place that would mark a milestone in Wallachia's history. Pedro and Ana, now 15 years old, were about to be officially invested as joint heirs to the kingdom, an unprecedented innovation that Eduardo and Leonor had designed to ensure both twins had equal participation in the nation's future. Pedro had grown into a young man whose presence filled rooms with a natural authority that combined royal dignity with deeply rooted compassion. His golden eyes had developed the ability to see not only what was, but what could be a skill he had perfected during years of walking among his people and listening to their real needs. Ana had flourished into a young woman whose beauty was only matched by her unbreakable determination. Her green eyes shone with the strategic intelligence she had inherited from her mother and the willpower she had forged for herself. She had quietly revolutionized expectations about what it meant to be a princess, training in both martial arts and diplomacy in economics and poetry. Archbishop Damião, now 75, but with a vitality that seemed nourished by the joy of serving. Such a harmonious royal family approached the altar where the twins awaited. Pedro and Ana of Wallachia. His voice resonated throughout the hall with the authority of one who had blessed 3 generations of royalty. Today you are invested not only as heirs, but as architects of your kingdom's future. Eduardo and Leonor, seated on their thrones, but radiating a humility that contrasted with the magnificence of their clothes, observed with a mixture of pride and emotion that threatened to overflow. Do you promise, the Archbishop continued, to govern not as rival siblings but as companions united in service to your people? We promise, Pedro and Ana responded in unison, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to bless the entire ceremony. Do you promise that your regency will be a continuation of the love and wisdom that have transformed this kingdom? We promise. Do you promise that you will never forget that true power comes from the capacity to serve, not the capacity to dominate? We promise. When the Archbishop placed the heir crowns on their heads, crowns that had been designed as a complementary pair, one representing justice and the other representing compassion, the hall exploded in applause that extended to the exterior squares where the people celebrated alongside their royalty. But it was after the ceremony, when the family retired to their private chambers, that the day's most significant moment occurred. Isabel, now 67, and having developed a physical fragility that contrasted with her spirit's strength, asked to speak with Pedro and Ana alone. She led them to the library where her conversation with Eduardo had taken place years ago, and there, surrounded by the manuscripts containing Wallachia's history, she gave them a scroll sealed with the kingdom's oldest royal seal. This, she murmured with a voice that trembled slightly, is my last gift to you, not as your grandmother, but as the last of the old order's queens. Pedro took the scroll with the reverence something clearly important deserved, while Ana sat next to Isabel with the natural closeness that had characterized their relationship since childhood. What is it, Grandma? Ana asked, placing her hand on Isabel's with tenderness. It's my confession, Isabel responded, the complete story of my mistakes, my manipulations, my attempts to control this family's destiny. But it's also my testimony about your extraordinary capacity to transform pain into wisdom. Pedro carefully unrolled the scroll and began reading aloud. It was an extraordinary document the autobiography of a woman who had been powerful, had lost her way, and had found redemption through her family's love. "Why are you giving us this?" Pedro asked when he finished reading. Isabel smiled with that mixture of melancholy and hope that had characterized her recent years. "Because I want you to understand that even people who make the gravest mistakes can change, grow, and find the path toward light. I want you to remember when you govern that your strength doesn't come from being perfect, but from your capacity to learn, forgive, and love." Canna leaned in and embraced her grandmother with an intensity that spoke of all the love that had grown between them during years of complicity and tenderness. "Grandma, you're not the woman who made those mistakes. You're the woman who taught us that love can transform any heart." Pedro joined the embrace, and the three remained thus for long minutes, creating a moment of intimacy none of them would ever forget. The eternal legacy. That night, while celebrations continued throughout the kingdom, and bells rang announcing the dawn of a new era, Eduardo and Leonor found themselves alone on their private balcony, observing the stars that seemed to shine with special intensity. "Do you believe we did well?" Leonor murmured, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. "Do you believe Pedro and Ana are prepared for the future that awaits them?" Eduardo surrounded her with his arms, feeling the same wonder he had felt every night for 11 years of shared happiness. "I believe we did something more than prepare them," he responded. "We showed them it's possible to govern from love, that it's possible to be strong without being cruel, that it's possible to change the world without losing one's soul." Leonor raised her face to look at him, and in her green eyes were tears of gratitude for everything they had built together. "Do you know what makes me most proud, Eduardo? It's not that we're successful kings, nor that we've transformed Wallachia. It's that our children grew up seeing true love as something normal, natural, expected. That will give them a strength no crown can provide." Eduardo kissed her with the tenderness that had characterized each of their kisses during 11 years of second marriage, and in that kiss was all the love that had survived exile, separation, conspiracies, and had emerged stronger and purer. While the stars watched them as silent witnesses to their happiness, neither knew that the next day they would receive news that would test everything they had built. A coalition of conservative kingdoms was forming to restore traditional order, and saw Wallachia as a threat that must be neutralized. But hadn't they already learned that true love is stronger than any external threat, and that a family united by authentic bonds can face any storm and emerge even stronger? 5 years later, when Pedro and Ana were 20 and the kingdom of Wallachia had become a diplomatic power, whose influence extended throughout the known world, the royal family gathered one last time in the garden where their second chance as a family had begun. The centennial oak that Eduardo had ordered, planted when the twins returned to the palace, had become a majestic giant whose branches extended like protective arms over the family table. Its leaves, golden in autumn, created a natural canopy that filtered the evening light in rays that seemed like blessings. Eduardo, now 40, too had developed the serene dignity of a man who had found his purpose and fulfilled it beyond his most ambitious dreams. His temples showed silver threads that Leonor declared to be honor medals for years well lived, and in his golden eyes was the peace that comes from knowing he had been a good husband, a good father, and a good king. Leonor, at 40, had flourished into a woman whose wisdom radiated like her own light. Her chestnut hair, now interwoven with silver threads, was gathered in a braid that made her look like an ancient wisdom goddess. Her face, marked by the soft lines left by a life full of true smiles, had the serenity of one who found exactly what she was destined to be. Pedro, already a young king in functions, Eduardo had formally abdicated 6 months earlier to dedicate himself to writing his reign's memoirs, had the natural presence of one born to lead, but learned that true leadership comes from service. His golden eyes had developed the ability to see potential in every person, and his reign had begun with reforms that were transforming not only Wallachia, but inspiring changes in neighboring kingdoms. Ana, who had rejected multiple marriage proposals from princes throughout Europe to dedicate herself to establishing the continent's first women's university, had developed an international reputation as a diplomat and scholar. Her green eyes shone with the satisfaction of one who found their unique path in the world, and her influence extended far beyond her native kingdom's borders. Isabel, now 70, had become the kingdom's most beloved figure after Pedro and Ana. Her transformation from manipulative queen to wise grandmother had inspired countless stories told in taverns and salons alike. That afternoon she observed her family with a smile that contained all the satisfaction of a life that had found its redemption. "You know what?" Eduardo murmured, raising his wine glass while observing his family in the evening's golden light. "There are moments when I have to remind myself that all this is real." Pedro laughed with that deep laughter he had inherited from his father, but enriched with his own joy. "Father, after 20 years, are you still surprised that we're happy?" "I'm surprised that we're so extraordinarily happy," Eduardo responded. "When I was young and lonely, I used to look at the stars and wonder if there existed somewhere in the world a happiness that had no price, no conditions, that wouldn't fade with time." Leonor took his hand across the table with that natural gesture she had repeated thousands of times, but which had never lost its magic. "And did you find the answer?" Eduardo looked at her with an intensity that made everyone present feel as if they were witnessing something sacred. "The answer is you. It's all of you. This family we built on separation's ruins, this love that grew stronger after being almost destroyed, these children, who taught us that the future can be more beautiful than any past." Ana, who had been carving small flowers in the table's wood, a habit she had developed when she wanted to preserve important moments, looked up with tears shining in her green eyes. "Do you know what I'll miss most when Pedro and I have to assume complete kingdom responsibilities?" "What, my little one?" Leonor asked. "These dinners, these moments when we're not kings or princesses, but simply a family that loves each other, without conditions." Pedro nodded, adding, "But we'll carry these moments with us wherever we go. You taught us that true nobility doesn't come from blood, but from the heart." Isabel, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke with a voice that trembled slightly with emotion. "You two have surpassed all my dreams. You've demonstrated it's possible to govern with compassion, lead with humility, and change the world without losing goodness." "We learned that from you," Ana responded, looking at her parents. "You taught us that true love can survive any storm, that second chances can be more beautiful than first beginnings, and that a united family can transform not only their own lives, but the entire world." Eduardo stood and raised his glass, and everyone else imitated him in a toast they knew they would remember forever. "To the love that found its way back home," he murmured. "To the children who taught us to be better than we were. To the lessons learned in separation that made reunion sweeter. And to the future we'll build together, a future where love will always be stronger than fear." "To family," Leonor added, "which is the greatest treasure any kingdom can possess." "To second chances," Pedro murmured, "which are often more beautiful than first ones." "To love that transcends time," Ana concluded, "and which will continue inspiring hearts long after we have departed." As they toasted under the stars that had witnessed their separation, their suffering, their reunion, and their triumph, each of them knew they had participated in something greater than their individual lives. They had demonstrated that true love can indeed conquer any obstacle, heal any wound, and create miracles that endure for generations. That night, when the family retired to rest, Eduardo and Leonor remained a moment longer in the garden, hand in hand under the starry sky. "Do you have any regrets?" Leonor murmured. "Only one," Eduardo responded. "I regret that we had to go through so much pain to learn what we now know. But even that made us stronger, wiser, more capable of appreciating happiness when it finally came." "Then it's not really a regret," Leonor smiled, but disguised gratitude. Eduardo kissed her under the stars, and in that kiss was all the love of 20 years of marriage, 5 years of separation that had made every moment together more precious, and the promise that their love story would continue inspiring hearts long after their names were only golden memories in history books. Because true love, as Eduardo and Leonor of Wallachia had learned, knows no endings. It only knows new beginnings, eternal as the stars that shine over all hearts that dare to believe in the magic of second chances. And so, in a kingdom where love had triumphed over ambition, where family had prevailed over politics and where wisdom had been born from suffering. The story of the king and the exiled queen reached its beautiful ending, which was also, like all truly happy endings, a new and eternal beginning.